Good evening, everyone. We're going to continue where we left off with Equal Rights from Terry Pratchett, page 71. When last we spoke, Granny and Esk were getting ready to move on to the unseen university where they have just found out is 500 miles away. And they're going to go to rest with Witch Hilda of Olham. Anywho, let's continue. Ulan was the market town for a wide, sprawling countryside, and the market day didn't end at sunset. Instead, torches flared at every booth, and stall and light blared forth from the open doorways of the inns. Even the temples put out colored lamps to attract nocturnal worshippers. Hilda moved through the crowd like a slim snake through dry grass, her entire stall and stock reduced to a surprisingly small bundle in her bag, and her jewelry rattling around like a sackful of flamenco dancers. Granny slumped along behind her feet aching from the unaccustomed prodding of the cobbles. And Esk got lost. It took some effort, but she managed it. It involved ducking between two stalls and then scurrying down a side alley. Granny had warned her at length about the unspeakable things that lurked in cities, which showed that the old woman was lacking a complete understanding of pedology, since Esk was not determined to see one or two of those things for herself. In fact, since Olahan was quite barbaric and uncivilized, the only things that went on after dark to any degree were a little thievery, some amateurish trading in the courts of lust, and drinking until you fell over or started singing, or both. According to the standard poetic instructions, one should move through a fair like this white swan in evening moves over the bay. But because of certain practical difficulties, Esk settled for moving through the crowd like a small dodging car, bumping from body to body, with the tip of the staff wavering a yard above her head. It caused some heads to turn, not only because it had hit them. Wizards occasionally passed through the town, and it was the first time anyone had seen one 4 feet tall with long hair. Anyone watching closely would have noticed strange things happening as she passed by. There was, for example, the man with 3 upturned cups who was inviting a small crowd to explore with him the exciting world of chance and probability as it related to the position of a small, dried pea. He was vaguely aware of the small figure watching him solemnly for a few moments, and then a sackful of peas cascaded out of every cup he picked up. Within seconds, he was knee-deep in legumes. He was a lot deeper in trouble. He suddenly owed everyone a lot of money. There was a small and wretched monkey that for years had shuffled vaguely along at the end of a chain while its owner played something dreadful on the pipe organ. It suddenly turned, narrowed its little red eyes, bit his keeper sharply in the leg, snapped his chain, and headed away over the rooftops with the night's takings in a tin cup. History is silent about what they were spent on. A box full of marzipan ducks on a nearby stall came suddenly to life and whirred past the stallholder to land, quacking happily, into the river, where by dawn they had all melted, and that's natural selection for you. The stall itself sidled on down an alley and was never seen again. Esk, in fact, moved through the fair more like an arsonist moves through a hayfield or a neutron bounces through a reactor, poets notwithstanding, and the hypothetical watcher could have detected her random passage by tracing the outbreaks of hysteria and violence. But, like all good catalysts, she wasn't actually involved in the processes she initiated, and by the time all the non-hypothetical potential watchers took their eyes off them, she had been buffeted somewhere else. She was also beginning to tire. While Granny Weatherwax approved of night on general principles, she certainly didn't hold the promiscuous twilight. If she had any reading to do after dark, she generally persuaded the owl to come and sit on the back of her chair and read through its eyes. So Esk expected to go to bed around sunset, and that was long past. There was a doorway ahead of her that looked friendly. Cheerful sounds were sidling out of the yellow light and pooling on the cobbles. With the staff still radiating random magic, like a demon lighthouse, she headed for it, weary but determined. The landlord of the Fiddler's Riddle considered himself to be a man of the world, and this was right, because he was too stupid to be really cruel, and too lazy to be really mean, and although his body had been around quite a bit, His mind has never gone further than the inside of his own head. He wasn't used to being adored or addressed by sticks, especially when they spoke in a small, piping voice and asked for goat's milk. Cautiously, aware that everyone in the inn was looking at him and grinning, he pulled himself along the bar top until he could see down. Esk stared up at him. "Look him right in the eyes," Granny had always said. "Focus your power on him. Stare him out. No one can outstare a witch. Except a goat, of course." The landlord, whose name was Skiller, found himself looking directly down at a small child who seemed to be squinting. "What?" he said. "Milk," said the child, still focusing furiously. "You get it out of goats, you know?" Skiller sold only beer, which his customers claimed he got out of cats. No self-respecting goat would have endured the smell in the fiddler's riddle. "We haven't got any," he said. He looked hard at the staff, and his eyebrows met conspiratorially over his nose. "You can have a look," said Esk. Skiller eased himself back across the bar, partly to avoid the gaze, which was causing his eyes to water in sympathy, and partly because a horrible suspicion was congealing in his mind. Even second-rate barmen tend to resonate with the beer they serve, and the vibrations coming from the big barrels behind him no longer had the twang of hop in a head. They are broadcasting an altogether more lactic note. He turned to tap experimentally and watched a thin stream of milk curdle into the drip bucket. The staff still poked over the edge of the counter like a periscope. He could swear that it was staring at him too. "Don't waste it," said a voice. "You'll be grateful for it one day." It was the same tone of voice Granny used when Esk was less than enthusiastic about a plate full of nourishing salad beans, boiled yellow until the last few vitamins gave in. But to Skiller's hypersensitive ears, it wasn't an injunction but a prediction. He shivered. He didn't know where he would have to be to make him grateful for a drink of ancient beer and curdled milk. He'd rather be dead first. Perhaps he would be dead first. He very carefully wiped a nearly clean mug with his thumb and filled it from the tap. He was aware that a large number of his guests were quietly leaving. No one liked magic, especially in the hands of a woman. You never knew what they would do, what might take it into their heads to do next. "Your milk," he said. "Miss," he added. "I've got some money," Eth said. Granny had always told her, "Always be ready to pay and you won't have to. People always like you to feel good about them. It's all headology." "No, wouldn't dream of it," said Skiller hastily. He leaned over the bar. "If you could see your way to turning the rest back, though, not much call for milk in these parts." He sidled along a little way, asking to lean the staff against the bar while she drank her milk. It was making him uncomfortable. Ez looked at him over a mustache of cream. "I didn't turn it into milk. I just knew it'd be milk because I wanted milk." "What did you think it was?" Beer," he said. Ez thought about this. She vaguely remembered trying beer once, and it had tasted sort of second-hand, but she could recall something which everyone in Bad Ass reckoned was much better than beer. It was one of Granny's most guarded recipes. It was good for you, because there was only fruit in it, plus lots of freezing and boiling and careful testing of little drops with a lighted flame. Granny would put a very small spoonful into her milk if it was a really cold night. It had to be a wooden spoon, though, on account of what it did to metal. She concentrated. She could picture the taste in her mind, and with a little skill that she was beginning to accept but couldn't understand, she found that she could take the taste apart into little colored shapes. Skiller's thin wife came out of the back room to see why it had all gone so quiet, and he waved her into shocked silence as Esk was swaying very slightly, with her eyes closed and her lips moving. Little shapes that you didn't need went back into the great pool of shapes, and then you found the extra ones that you needed and put them together. And then there was a sort of hook thing, which meant they could turn into anything suitable, into something just like them. And then Skiller turned very carefully, regarded the barrel behind him. The smell of the room had changed again. He could feel the pure gold sweating gently out of the ancient woodwork. With some care, He took a small glass from his store under the counter, and with a few splashes of the dark golden liquid escaped from the tap. He looked at it thoughtfully in the lamplight, turned the glass around methodically, sniffed it a few times, then tossed the contents back in one swallow. His face remained unchanged, although his eyes were a bit moist and his throat wobbled somewhat. His wife and Esk watched him as a thin beading of sweat broke out along his forehead. 10 seconds passed, and he was obviously out to break some heroic record. There may have been steam coming out from his ears, but that could have been a rumor. His fingers drummed a strange tattoo on the bar top. At last he swallowed, appeared to reach a decision, turned solemnly to Esk and said, "No." His brow wrinkled as he ran the sentence past his mind again and made a second attempt. He gave up. His wife snorted and took the glass out of his unprotesting hand. She sniffed it. She looked at the barrels, all 10 of them. She met his unsteady eye. In a private paradise for two, they silently calculated the selling price of 600 gallons of triple-distilled White Mountain peach brandy and ran out of numbers. Mrs. Skiller was quicker on the uptake than her husband. She bent down and smiled at Esk, who was too tired to squint back. It wasn't a particularly good smile, because Mrs. Skiller didn't get much practice. "How did you get here, little girl?" she said, in a voice that suggested gingerbread cottages and the slamming of big stove doors. "I got lost from Granny," I said. "And where's Granny now, dear?" Clang went the oven doors again. It's going to be a tough night for all wanderers in metaphorical forests. "Just somewhere, I expect." "Would you like to go and sleep in a big feather bed, all nice and warm?" Esk looked at her gratefully, even while vaguely realizing the woman had a face just like an eager ferret, and nodded. "You're right. It's going to take much more than a passing woodchopper to sort this out." Granny, meanwhile, was 2 streets away. She was also, by the standards of other people, lost. She would not like to see it that way, though. She knew where she was. It's just that everywhere else didn't. It has already been mentioned that it was much harder to detect a human mind than, say, the mind of a fox. The human mind, seeing this as some kind of slur, wants to know why. This is why. Animal minds are simple, and therefore sharp. Animal minds never spend time dividing experience into little bits and speculating about all the little bits they've missed. The whole panoply of the universe has been neatly expressed to them as things to A, mate with, B, eat, C, run away from, and D, rocks. This frees the mind from unnecessary thoughts and gives it a cutting edge where it matters. The normal animal, in fact, never tries to walk and chew gum at the same time. The average human, on the other hand, thinks about all sorts of things around the clock, on all sorts of levels, with interruptions from dozens of biological calendars and timepieces. There's thoughts about what to be said, and private thoughts, and real thoughts, and thoughts about thoughts, and a whole gamut of subconscious thoughts. To a telepath, the human head is a din, is a railway terminus with all the tannoys talking at once, is a complete FM wave band, and some of those stations aren't reputable. They're outlawed pirates from forbidden seas who play late-night records with limbic lyrics. Granny, trying to locate Esk by mind magic alone, was trying to find a straw in a haystack. She was not succeeding, but enough blips of sense reached her through the heterodyne whales with 1,000 brains all thinking at once to convince her the world was, indeed, as silly as she always believed it was. She met Hilda at the corner of a street. She was carrying her broomstick, the better to conduct an aerial search. She was distraught. "Not so much as a hint of her," said Granny. "Have you been down to the river? She might have fallen in," said Hilda. Then she had just fallen out again. Anyway, she can swim. "I think she's hiding, Dratter." "What are we going to do?" Granny gave her a withering look. Hilda Goat Founder, I'm ashamed of you, acting like a coward. Do I look worried? Hilda peered at her. You do, a bit. Your lips have gone all thin. I'm just angry, that's all. Gypsies always come here for the fair. They might have taken her. Granny was prepared to believe anything about city folk, but here she was on firmer ground. And they're a lot dapper than I'd give them credit for. Look, she's got the staff. What good would that do? Said Hilda, who was close to tears. I don't think you've understood anything I've told you, said Granny severely. All we need to do is go back to your place and wait. What for? The screams or the bangs and the fireballs or whatever, said Granny vaguely. That's heartless. Oh, I expect they've got it coming to 'em. Come on, you go on ahead and put the kettle on. Hilda gave her a mystified look, then climbed onto her broom and rose slowly, erratically, into the shadows among the chimneys. If broomsticks were cars, this one would be a split-window Morris Minor. Granny watched her go, then thumped along the wet streets after her. She was determined they wouldn't get her up on one of those things. Esk lay in the big, fluffy, and slightly damp sheets of the spare bed in the attic room of the Riddle. She was tired, but she couldn't sleep. The bed was too chilly, for one thing. She wondered uneasily if she tried to dare warm it up, but she thought better of it. She couldn't seem to get the hang of fire spells, no matter how many times or how carefully she experimented. They either didn't work at all or worked too well. The woods around the cottage were becoming treacherous with holes left by disappearing fireballs. At least, if the wizardry thing didn't work out, then Granny said she'd have a fine future as a privy builder or a well sinker. She turned over and tried to ignore the bed's faint smell of mushrooms. Then she reached out in the darkness until her hand found the staff propped against the bedhead. Mrs. Skiller had been quite insistent about taking it downstairs, but Esk had hung on to it with a grim death. It was the only thing in the world that she was absolutely certain belonged to her. The varnished surface with its strange carvings felt oddly comforting. Esk went to sleep and dreamed bangles and strange packages and mountains and distant stars above the mountains and a cold desert where strange creatures lurched across the dry sand and stared at her through insect eyes. There was a creak on the stairs, then another, then a silence. The sort of choking, furry silence made by someone standing as still as possible. The door swung open. Skiller made a blacker shadow against the candlelight on the stairs, and there was a faintly whispered conversation before he tiptoed as silently as he could toward the bedhead. The staff slipped sideways as his first cautious grope dislodged it, but he caught it quickly and let his breath out very slowly. So he hardly had enough left to scream when the staff moved in his hands. He felt the scaliness, the coil, the muscle of it. Esk sat bolt upright in time to see Skiller roll backward down the stair ladder, still flailing desperately at something quite invisible that coiled around his arms. There was another scream from below as he landed on his wife. The staff clattered to the floor and lay surrounded by a faint octarine glow, the color of magic. Esk got out of bed and padded across the floor. There was a terrible cursing. It sounded unhealthy. She peered around the door and looked down into the face of Mrs. Skiller. You give me that staff! Esk reached down behind her and gripped the polished wood. No, it's mine. Not the right sort of thing for little girls, snapped the barman's wife. It belongs to me, said Esk, and quietly closed the door. She listened for a moment to the muttering from below and tried to think about what to do next. Turning the couple into something would probably only cause a fuss, and anyway, she wasn't quite certain how to do it. The fact was, the magic only really worked when she wasn't thinking about it. Her mind seemed to get in the way. She padded across the room and pushed open the tiny window. The strange nighttime smell of civilization drifted in. The damp smell of streets, the fragrance of garden flowers, the distant hint of an overloaded privy. There were wet tiles outside. As Skiller started back up the stairs, she pushed the staff onto the roof and crawled after it, steadying herself on the carvings above the window. The roof dipped down into an outhouse, and she managed to stay at least vaguely upright as she half slid, half scrambled down the uneven tiles. A 6-foot drop onto a stack of old barrels, a quick scramble down the slippery wood, and she was trotting easily across the inn yard. As she kicked up the street, mists she could hear the sound of arguments coming from the riddle. Skiller rushed past his wife and laid a hand on the tap of the nearest barrel. He paused and wrenched it open. The smell of peach brandy filled the room, sharp as knives. He shut off the float and relaxed. Afraid it would turn into something nasty? Asked his wife. He nodded. Well, if you hadn't been so clumsy, I tell you, it bit me. You could have been a wizard and we didn't have to deal with all this. Have you got no ambition? She said. Skiller shook his head. I reckon it takes more than a staff to make a wizard. Anyway, I heard where it said wizards aren't allowed to get married. They're not even allowed to... He hesitated. To what? Allowed to what? Said Mr. Skiller. Skiller arrived. Well, you know, thing. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Skiller said briskly. No, suppose not. He followed her reluctantly out to the darkened barroom. It seemed to him that perhaps wizards didn't have such a bad life at that. He was proved right the following morning, when it was revealed that the 10 barrels of peace brandy had indeed turned into something nasty. Esk wandered aimlessly through the gray streets until she reached Ulan's tiny river docks. Broad, flat-bottomed barges bobbed gently against the wharves, and one or two of them curled whiffs of smoke from friendly stovepipes. Esk clambered easily onto the nearest and used his staff to lever up the oilcloth that covered most of it. A warm smell, a mixture of lanolin and midden, drifted up. The barge was laden with wool. Now, it's silly to go to sleep on an unknown barge, not knowing what strange cliffs may be drifting past you when you wake, not knowing the barges traditionally get an early start, setting out before the sun is barely up, not knowing what new horizons might greet you on the morrow. You know that. Ask didn't. And we'll pause there on page 82. Hope you guys had a great weekend. Hope you had the start of a great week. And remember that I love you. I'll see you soon.